In this video, I'd like to explain how I changed both my rear wheel bearings on my 2013 all-wheel drive Lincoln MKX. This is an identical procedure for 2011 and newer Ford Edge all-wheel drive and the MKX all-wheel drive. The difference being, with the all-wheel drive, you have an axle shaft going into the back of the bearing. So what I did, I jacked the vehicle up and I went underneath the rear passenger door, and just ahead of the rear suspension you'll see a good jacking point. So I lifted it up there, and then from the back, just in front of the front bumper, I put my jack stand, just to be safe. Then you use a 3/4 inch deep socket to undo the wheel nuts and remove the wheel. You will need a 15mm wrench or socket, and you will need a 32mm deep socket for the center nut that holds the shaft into the hub. I have air tools, but if you don't, you can use a Johnson bar and a hand ratchet. It's not essential, but it certainly speeds the job up. I had two to do. This one was on the passenger side, so this is the one I tackled first, and it was textbook easy. There are other YouTube videos on removing these hubs, and I'll just run briefly through how it's done. When you don't get any aggravation, you just jack the thing up, you take the wheel off, then you remove the carrier that holds the caliper on, and you swing that up and tie it up out of the way with a piece of wire. The next thing to do is undo a small set screw and remove the disc rotor. Then you need to undo this large 32mm nut. There's about 1 inch of thread sticking out here, and I just went around it with a battery drill and a little cut brush, cleaned the rust off the thread, sprayed some lube on it, and then placing a bar, a suitable bar, through the studs, resting on the ground to stop the hub rotating, I removed the large 32mm nut. The next step from the back is you have to undo 4 bolts with the 15mm socket. They come out quite easy. The only part that grips in the suspension arm is this shiny 1/4 inch area right here. The rest of it is smaller in diameter. This area is the piece that's pressed into the cast iron arm. Above it, just about here, is a very delicate wheel speed sensor. I chose not to try and prise these speed sensors out because they're made of plastic. You can undo a little 8mm wrench sized bolt, but you cannot really lever at them or prise them out. They get stuck pretty good. So when this is drawing out, you've got to remember to lower the axle to avoid damaging the speed sensor and draw it off the splines. When you go to reassemble with the new one, I coated this area with anti-seize, and I cleaned out inside the cast iron hub carrier and coated that with anti-seize. So then you slide it on the splines, and you put the 4 bolts in from the back and draw the whole assembly in and tighten those bolts up. Then you have to put the larger nut back on the shaft, so more anti-seize went on that, and I locked it again and torqued up the large nut in the middle to 200 foot-pounds. And then of course you reassemble it in the reverse order. The reason I'm doing this video though is because when I went to do the driver's side, things were dramatically different. Look at the difference of these two. Instead of just being able to tap this off, which shifts it and gets it out of this little area, this one here would not move. You can see where I really did have a go with that hammer, and it wouldn't budge. It was well and truly rusted in. You can see all the corrosion here. This is cast iron that this is pushed in, and this is iron, and the whole lot had rusted together. So I had to come up with another plan. What I did, using a mini grinder and a zip cut wheel, which is very thin, I carefully shaved into the lug, and the one directly opposite I shaved into the lug. The reason for doing that is because an air chisel, when there's no gap, it can't do the job. If you make a little gap for it, when it can force its way in and prise the thing apart. So once I've done my shaving, you've got to be very careful only to shave this lug. Do not let the wheel touch the cast iron arm. Keep it away from that. So once I've done that, I went at it with an air chisel. It still would not move. It was tight. So the next stage, with the zip cut wheel, I cut one of the studs and punched the remaining piece out. That enabled me to use a scrap bolt that I just have laying around, and I screwed this in, and I found a solid part on the cast iron arm that I could screw this up against, and I really tightened this as best as I could. I used a wrench that long. I got this super tight, and once I've got that pressing against the arm, when I went in there with a chisel, it finally broke the bond between the rusted items. So if it wasn't for the fact I've done this, I don't know how I would have got it off. Removing the whole arm was not an option. There's about 7 rusty looking bolts holding the whole arm on. It's a great big epic job. So I was determined to do it on the vehicle, and I managed to do it. I managed to get this out, and then I really cleaned the hole in the arm. I used a little air grinder with a flat wheel in it, but you can use sandpaper or a scraper, but get rid of all the rust in the arm. And then I coated that with anti-seize. I coated this new one with anti-seize and reassembled the whole thing. So all in all, doing it with an old bolt and a mini grinder, that's what finally moved this. If you don't have air tools, you can use a hammer and a chisel, but air tools certainly helped. But it's not impossible to do if you don't have air tools. This here, I put on the studs to help push the shaft through as I'm drawing this out, but it wasn't very tight. The splines weren't seized. I just actually put this socket on here and did it up by hand as I'm drawing it out once I'd loosened it. You've got to be really careful of that speed sensor though. It sits about here, and being plastic, you cannot prise them out. Also, some people would say, why didn't I just heat everything up and use heat? Well, there's several reasons I didn't bother. Cast iron has a low expansion rate. You won't expand it hardly at all. Behind the hub is a sheet metal splash guard for the rotor. One slip with a cutting torch and you'll burn a hole straight through that instantly. And if the flame licks around towards the top, that's where your speed sensor and wire is. Then you could end up frying that. So I wanted to do it cold. I wanted to do it on the vehicle. And this is the idea I came up with. Slice this, being careful not to touch the arm, and then put a bolt through, and then using a chisel, it broke it free from the rust. This was the bearing that was making all the noise. Obviously, this one looked very different. I bought this vehicle 2.5 years ago with 83,000 kilometers on it, which is about 52,000 miles. This had already been changed. This one was original. When I did the job 3 weeks ago, it had 116,000 kilometers on it, which is about 72,500 miles. And this one had lasted all that time. This one obviously failed early on and was replaced. I removed this seal here just to look at the bearings. It's got shiny bearings, fresh grease, nice and smooth. Didn't really need changing, but I didn't know that at the time. And I'm the kind of guy that, okay, if one bearing's going, the other one's going to go soon. So it was a Saturday, I bought two. And I did this one first. Fair enough, it's already been done. But then this one was the one that started whining. So that's how I did it. It took me quite a while to figure out how to get this stubborn one out. This one was textbook easy. I hope this video helps a few of you. Here in Canada we use a lot of salt on the road in the winters, and it's salt that makes everything go rusty. And obviously, as you can see, this